So thank you very much for the kind invitation to come here. And I'm going to talk about an annotation of both implicit and explicit discourse relations in the Tübingen tree bank, which took place back when I was in Tübingen 2 years ago, and also some experiments on predicting those relations. And sometimes you have a text, and the text has multiple sentences. Like here, if you have 4 pencils and I have 7 apples, how many pancakes will fit on the roof? Purple, because aliens don't wear hats. And we see it doesn't really make sense to us, but we still see the structure. And there is an if. Oops, that was the wrong key. There is an if that says that this one, 4 pencils and 7 apples, has a connection to the how many pancakes. The and tells us that the 4 pencils and the 7 apples have something to do with each other. There's a question in there, and there's a because. And through these discourse markers, we see that there's a structure, and even though the text doesn't make sense to us, we still see the structure. Sometimes these connectives are ambiguous, and then it depends on the contents of those sentences. And as the contractual obligations are still in force, a further 215 million euros will be paid out. Then that would be a causal relations. Because of the contractual obligations, there will be a payout. And then you have, for example, a result relation. You can also have cases where 2 sentences are next to each other and you don't have a connective, and there is still a discourse relation. In the meantime, this has become a matter of course. The common work helps to appreciate each other. It's a text about people doing a theater play together who are from different nationalities, and they learn to appreciate each other. And because of that, understanding each other has become a matter of course. So if you look at discourse connectives across languages, within Europarl, that was an automatic alignment of German connectives and English connectives. You see that there are groups of connectives that kind of pretty much correspond to each other, but you have things that are kind of ambiguous in German but not in English, or vice versa. So there are ambiguous discourse connectives, and sometimes they show different ambiguities between languages, but sometimes they also pattern very well across languages, and you could say that even though they correspond to different discourse relations, it's still a common function. And within discourse annotation, there are 2 things that you could call like de facto standards or industry standards. One is constituent-based and based on something called rhetorical structure theory, where you have basically spans of discourse, which are at the lowest level elementary discourse units. So an elementary discourse unit is, for example, a clause or something that a speaker may assert. And then basically you merge those to form larger discourse units. And this is the case in the RST corpus, which means a corpus that was built in the early 2000s in California. That's also mostly the case with the Tübingen tree bank, and there's also French corpus of that kind, which was annotated with crossing relations. So basically RST assumes that you don't have to have crossing relations, and that creates some problems. And you can also say we want crossing relations, and then you get a different set of problems. Or you could start from the intuitive notion that it's the discourse connectives that are actually important. And then you have discourse connectives that link clausal arguments. And the implicit relations could be something where you say, okay, there is not a connective, but we can picture it with a connective, and then it makes perfect sense. Which then kind of is somewhat questionable for relative clauses or for sentence fragments. And in the Penn discourse tree bank, they do implicit relations between neighboring sentences only, and they don't make any assumptions about global structure. So the kind of orthodox RST view is that the whole text is one big tree, and the Penn discourse tree bank says we just care about neighboring sentences, and there's kind of a space between that. And basically I've called them styles of discourse parsing because they actually encode similar information in different but equivalent ways. So you have a segmentation task where in RST you need to find these elementary units, for example clauses, and then you have one elementary unit, Peter is hungry, and one elementary unit, but his fridge is empty. And if you did that in the Penn style, you would say, no, it's about finding connectives. Peter is hungry, but his fridge is empty. And but once you go past that level, you're starting to annotate structure. And in RST, you kind of use lower level discourse units to build higher level ones, and then you get something like Peter is hungry but his fridge is empty, where you've got one big discourse unit that has two smaller ones as their constituents. And in Penn style, you would start from the connective, and then you would need to identify which are the arguments of the discourse relation. And you see that basically at that level it's similar information. If you have arg1 and arg2, you could ask, given those plus maybe some context, what is the discourse relation? And basically in the TüBa-DZ we said that discourse relations are hierarchical, that there are stretches of content, coherent text, that are about one particular thing, meaning the speaker does one very complex speech act. Sometimes not very complex, but usually like it's one speech act covering several sentences, like explaining something or making the case for something. And then basically at the top of this kind of speech act thing, you have things that not at all who investigated what should be a discourse relation or not call a top-level nucleus, and work on text segmentation calls a subtopic. And the other assumption we built into our annotation scheme is that discourse relations can be coordinating or subordinating, and that they introduce a hierarchical structure. That is not an assumption that everyone likes, and you could make both a case for it and against it. But the idea is that coordinating discourse relations are conjunctive, and they link segments pertaining to the same topic, meaning you have a sequence of things that all serve one topic, and between those elements of the sequence there are discourse relations. And subordinating relations introduce a subordinating topic. So there is research that supports this idea. So Van Kupperveld is one person who in the 90s said that basically discourse topics should be modeled as questions, and then basically if you have one level of discourse, it all serves to answer this particular question. And if you have subordinating relations, you've got one segment of discourse kind of feeding a new question into the discourse, which is not spoken, but which is kind of shared as a notion between the two speakers. And then basically the subordinated discourse elements then again serve to answer that question. There is also work by a person named Truruka, who said that basically these coordinating relations are those that you can express with an AND, because the AND somehow forces a common topic. And there is a follow-up article by Escher and Vieux where they said, but it's actually not all that way. And they looked at some more complex cases. And the intuition is that discourse relations can be expressed through connectives, and that's our working definition for what is a discourse relation. It doesn't mean that everything that is expressed through a connective is a discourse relation in our annotation, and it doesn't mean that all the discourse relations in our annotation are expressed through connectives. So, as an example, there are some producers apparently fear loss in their image if they continue to offer genetically modified produce. And then in Germany, the frozen goods manufacturer Frosta has said goodbye to his GM produce. In England, 9 leading trade houses don't go with it any longer, and they want to keep their own brands free from GM. And in 6 further European countries, supermarket chains don't want to bother their customers with GM produce. And there you have 3 kind of discourse units. One is in Germany something, and then in England something, and then in the other countries something. And basically this is something this is a claim that is substantiated and explained by this larger discourse segment. And you see that between these neighboring discourse segments you can have a parallel relation in Germany, in England, which serves to kind of tie these up into a bigger discourse segment. And then this explanation relation actually says what role this bigger discourse segment plays for the superordinated discourse unit. So then we started to say, okay, and what are the things that should be in a discourse relation? As in, if we see that is a good indication for a discourse relation. So you can have relations between events, and those are kind of the prototypical examples of discourse relations for certain people, where if you have Peter had a ski accident and broke his leg, then a competent reader infers that those 2 events have something to do with each other, and he broke his leg while in that ski accident, and not 2 months later when a car hit him. Or you could have relations between propositions. Even though Peter broke his leg, he is perfectly happy, and then you have an expectation. Breaking your leg makes you unhappy. And even though Peter broke his leg, he's perfectly happy. And then those are causal relations between propositions, not between events. And concession relations, actually, these, even though, work the same. Or in that same group, you can have relations between a proposition and a speech act. Since you're near the window, can you raise the shades? The since you're near the window provides kind of some context to the request, can you raise the shades? And this doesn't mean the same as can you raise the shades because of being near the window. It's actually the request that is embedded and not the discourse relation that's under the request. Oops. Other things that don't fit in this causal relation pattern that we found to be good indicators of a discourse relation are contrasts. So you can have the AFB delegates consented to the 86 millions, while Günther Dieckerne requests an inquiry commission. This has the same meaning as Günther Dieckerne requests an inquiry commission, while the AFB delegates consented to the 86 millions. So this is something you can do. You can kind of switch around things and see if it still has the same meaning. And if it does, then you see, okay, it should be a symmetric discourse relation. And if it doesn't work, you can exclude certain relations and have some others. In this case, for example, it's unlikely to be a temporal relation and it's unlikely to be a concession relation. Or sometimes you can't switch them around, but there are both answers to a common question, and they only make sense if you read them as answers to a common questions. If you have something like Susie likes pandas, but Peter Stiggett is only valid up to Barmbek, and you assume that Barmbek is a place and there are zones in the public transport system, then without any question under discussion, it's still weird. Like, what do the pandas and the train tickets have to do with each other? But if the question is, should we go to the zoo, then Susie likes pandas means, yes, let's go to the zoo. And Peter Stiggett is only valid up to Barmbek would suggest, like, no, let's do this another day. And this is something else than saying Peter Stiggett is only valid up to Barmbek, but Susie likes pandas. And what should not be part of a discourse relation? So as a background, this RST annotation scheme has been around for quite a long time, since around 1990. And people have been annotating resources with it. And if you ask those people, like, does it work perfectly? They will say, oh, it works perfectly until you care about, like, agreement that people annotate the same structure on top of the same discourse. And one view on that is, well, it's a personal question. How does this person understand this discourse? And the other answer to this problem is, well, we're annotating too much. Let's kind of keep to the things that do not, that we can analyze with linguistic knowledge and not kind of making assumptions about the world or people's writing process. And one of the things that people said should maybe not be part of this discourse relation annotation are intensional notions. Intensional notions are something like, I want to tell you that other thing, but before I do that, I need to tell you about this. So I want to ask people to provide funding for my animal home, and before I say give me money for my animal home, I have to convince them. And that's kind of the part where you go from, like, one speech act to multiple speech act that are correlated in a way that is mostly conventional. Like, I can say, pass me the salt, but without kind of talking about the importance of salt to the human society. And so Sanders and Spuren say intentions and discourse coherence are to be separated. Some intentions are realized without any coherence relation, which means that sometimes coherence relations and intentional notions coincide with each other, sometimes they don't. Others are realized in a preverbal message containing an illocutionary relation. And still others are realized as a propositional relation. So basically, cause is a coherence relation where you say, Peter had a ski accident, he broke his leg. Evidence is an illocutionary relation because we're talking about not the things themselves, but what we think of those things, and kind of these relations between facts and why we assume one fact. those are illocutionary relations, and those are still things that we wanted as discourse relations, and that Sanders and Sporen also say should be discourse relations. And then RST has this relation, preparation, which is kind of this kind of, I want to ask you for money for my animal home, and therefore I talk to you about animals in general. And they say that those are purely intentional, and they're not accompanied by a coherence relation. Another thing that we excluded from our discourse annotation is anaphoric reference. So, not at all remark that low-level relations between clauses and sentences can typically be signaled directly by conjunctions, and that's kind of a good indicator that if it can be signaled by a conjunction, then there is a discourse relation. But conjunctions cannot be used to link arbitrary large passages of text. And then, basically, an explicit, if you need to make it explicit, a slightly different mechanism is used, which includes a new mention of the top nucleus of the first span. So, connectives like therefore or then can link kind of adjacent units, but they can also kind of make a larger links across kind of structural elements, and then not at all say this is anaphoric reference, this is not what we want to be in our discourse relations, or they call it coherence relations. And I think that it makes perfect sense to distinguish between kind of the discourse relations that link adjacent segments and the discourse relations that kind of go across the structure through anaphoric means. So then we built this nice annotation tool where you had basically sentences or clauses, and you could subdivide sentences into clauses, and you could kind of, as a visual aid rather than as part of the annotation, kind of indent some of these clauses or elementary units, and then basically you don't really, I think it's not very readable, but then basically any contiguous span among those units is a discourse unit, and you can have relations that hold between those spans of discourse units. And that's what we have in this TüBa-DZ data set. And we did multiple experiments with Annotator Agreement. We have multiple levels in the taxonomy, and initially we started out with 3 documents, and we let 2 annotators annotate those, and we looked like how many of the relations are common, and if the relations are common, do people agree on the labeling. And we got a kappa of 0.55 for individual relations and a kappa of 0.65 for the middle level of the taxonomy. So if you go to very, very fine-grained relations, you get agreement that most people are not happy about, even though it's kind of what most people doing discourse annotation get. And like this, around this range of kappa from 0.55 to 0.65, and that's because it's a task that is not easy. And then in a second experiment with annotators that were trained a little bit more, we got higher kappa of 0.59 and 0.69. And in general, we allowed people to have multiple relations. So, for example, a temporal relation such as narration could coincide with a causal relation such as result cause. And we counted those only when the complete set is equal. And if you do adjudication, which means that you offer both annotators the relations that both they and the other person has annotated, and you ask them, please synthesize this into one common version. Then you get a very high kappa of 0.9, which...
I have a question. While you have the slide on, two questions. One is, how many relations there were as individual relations, and how many there were on the middle level?
Okay, that is actually on the next slide.
Okay, sorry.
So this slide leaves out, I think, 5 or 6 relations because they are quite infrequent, and they are also quite infrequent as implicit relations. And but basically, this is relation groups. These 5: contingency, comparison, expansion, temporal, and reporting. And then the middle level would be causal and conditional and denial. And the lowest level of the taxonomy would be something like concession and coordinating concession, because we made a distinction here. And I mean, because you see that concession and coordinating concession is a distinction that comes through this distinction that we wanted to make between coordinating discourse relations and subordinating discourse relations, where suddenly then you get kind of 2 relations of what you intuitively think of as one type. Does that answer you?
Have you allowed something like I don't know or ambiguous?
We didn't allow people to say, well, I mean, we allowed them to make commentaries that they don't know or that they find this sketchy. And then basically in the revision process, the person who kind of merges the annotation would have seen that. But we didn't have a formal way of saying, I don't know. So we asked people to, like, please think about it and make a structure out of this, and if something looks sketchy to you, then it might be that that's actually this upper level of topic segments or like larger speech acts where it gets sketchy. And that's part of what we found. Like, if you go to larger units, we had actually quite decent agreement on like the segmentation of the text. But all the relations that were kind of on these upper levels kind of got a little bit kind of sketchier, because then there are more things that you make assumptions about, I think. So, yeah. And if we look at only the implicit relations, because this annotation scheme, we said, let's annotate all the discourse relations, and then kind of some will be marked through discourse connectives, some will be marked through other means, some will be unmarked. Then you see that there are lots of result and explanation relations. There are lots of these elaborations. So restatement means you have about the same fact, but you talk about it in different perspectives. Instant is you have a general fact and then you make a specific example. And background means that you say something and then you say a supporting thing that helps you make your point, but it's actually more general. And then there are also like these temporal relations, and we had reporting relations such as Peter said, the flowers are yellow. That would be a reporting relations. It would not be a reporting relations in the pen scheme, where they say that's a different thing. And we followed the RST tradition of doing things, which is then forces you to have one attribution relation where you say the thing said is actually what's important, and like providing the information who said it is less important, and source, where you say the fact that so-and-so makes this claim is actually the important one, and it tells you something about him. And then if you look at relations and how they're marked, you see that result relations are frequently unmarked. Explanation relations are most frequently unmarked. Restatement is unmarked, like in all the standard cases. Background and instance and continuation are unmarked in almost all cases. And another thing that we did that the pen-style discourse annotation does not is that, for example, relative clauses are in our scheme implicit relations. So if I say, I met Peter who works at the so-and-so bank, then that would be a background relation in our scheme. And in the pen scheme, it would not be a discourse relation because they only have the implicit relations between sentences. If we look at typical relations for things that mark discourse relations, we see that unmarked has lots of relations, and perplexity means about, like, it's as complicating as choosing between 16 different things, which means there are both kind of more relations that can be unmarked, but kind of with this long tail of relations and this kind of imbalance of restatement and background being the most important ones, it still means that you have to, it's about as difficult as doing a 16-way choice. And then und can be conjunction, narration, continuation. Aber can be concession or contrast. And when can either introduce a consequence or a condition. So many of these discourse connectives are ambiguous, but the most ambiguous case is when there's no connective. And that leads me to the experiments about classifying these discourse relations, where as input we assume that we have two argument spans plus some context maybe, and the output should be the discourse relations that hold between these argument spans. And this is not fully realistic because you assume that someone gives you these argument spans, and that's already an interesting task, but I'm not going to talk about it. So then we have these state-of-the-art shallow features. They're state-of-the-art because lots of people have tried them, and they actually don't work that bad. And if you take n-grams of words per the speech and lemma, or word pairs across sentences, so you take one word from one sentence and one word from the other sentence, and then structural parts, meaning if you have a constituent tree, then one expansion from this constituent tree, and you add the information, this has been found in the first constituent tree, or in the second constituent tree, or in both. And then another thing that's highly indicative is the type of connection. Are these syntactically embedded? And then you can ask, is it before the verb? Is it kind of after the clause? And then once you move past single clauses, you have like meets or after relations. So after can occur if there is kind of intervening material between the two argument spans, and then of course that is indicative for or against certain discourse relations. Then, if you want to add linguistic features, you would take something such as negation or tense and mood. So if there is something like must be or should be, then that usually indicates that there are some things that are hypothesized, or at least something where not some factual thing is asserted. Then semantic heads are usually indicative, and then you can look for cotaxonomic relations between the two clauses. So if in one clause there is hot and in the other clause there is cold, you could say, oh, this looks like a contrast pair. What you can also do is use a sentiment lexicon, and then basically you get features for one clause that says there are negative polarity words and it's negated. So because not bad doesn't mean the same as bad or pretty bad, then you still want these shifters to be part of the information you extract. And that's all fine, but at the end you want a structured representation. So many useful features contain information about parts of a discourse unit, and if we just extract features, as in kind of, is this in there or is that in there, then that loses some information because it doesn't tell you, oh, actually the negation is in the same place as this contrast, for example. So our approach was to represent each, or our way of trying to attack this problem was to represent each discourse unit as a feature graph, and then use an approach to classification where you could just stick in these feature graphs and kind of have it find informative structures. And there are ways to do this. All of them work. Not all of them are kind of effective in terms of the time you put in. You can't write handwritten rules, and that's very time consuming. And it also means that you have to kind of have good linguistic knowledge about what goes on and try different things out. So even if you have some engine that matches these patterns, it's very time consuming, and it's also like if you provide a good linguistic description, that doesn't mean that it's a good feature for machine learning. So usually you have to approximate things, and then like one linguistic insight corresponds to maybe 6 versions of one particular feature, that if you're serious about writing it in this kind of pattern approach, you have to try out all of them and see which one works. Then you can do substructure extraction, which means that you have the structure and you try to mine parts of the structure, and then you map each structure to a list of found parts. And then there's also this idea of using kernel methods to represent these structures implicitly. So you use a convolution kernel, which is kind of a similarity function, and then you can use structural similarity in an approach that basically works in an implicit space, but says this example is important, this example is important, and then looks at those support vectors, the important examples, to figure out how the next example should be classified. And as an example, that's a German sentence, nun will ich endlich in Frieden leben, and it's annotated according to this Tübingen scheme of annotating things, where we've got the kind of verb in the second place, and then we've got the non-finite verb in the verb last place. You've got the subject, which is a noun phrase, which is marked as a subject. And we've got these topological fields where you have things that are in front of the verb, things that are in this middle field, and you can also have things that are kind of after the clause in this post field. And if you extract information about the parts of this clause, you've got a sentence node which has a modifier wollen. So it's got a modal verb, it's got an indicative root, it's got present tense, a certain category, and the lemma of the head. And you can do that thing to the argument where you say, this is a noun phrase, it's the subject, the ich in that case is old, it has been mentioned before, and it is in the middle field. And you can also say, do the same with a modifier, where you, for example, the noon is in the pre-field, it's got a noon as its head, and it's a temporal modifier. So basically you've got these backbone nodes, which are kind of the things that I care about, and then you attach features to these backbone nodes. And in the graph representation that we use for graph mining, then of course both the backbone nodes and the features would become nodes, because that's the representation. But like, if you picture it this way, then it's a more convenient representation if you want to talk about it. So we've seen the syntax information, node category, topological field, grammatical function. Then for adverbials, a semantic classification, named entities get a semantic class. And then a distinction between new entities. Mediated entities means, for example, if I talk about someone and then his dog would be mediated because it's modified by this his, so we know where the dog comes from even though the dog is new. And then old means it has been mentioned before. And we want to assign multiple relations, which gives us kind of a more complicated setting for the evaluation. So we want to assign partial credit for overlap between system and gold labelings, which means that a single relation instance is scored with a dice score, so that if there are two relations and we guess like only one or three of them, then we get partial credit. And there's also this micro-average F-score where we say, okay, across all relations, what is the average score of all relations? And then basically we again have these 5 relation types that are very coarse and the 21 finer grained. And in the first experiments, we see one classifier for linguistic features, and then classifiers for unigrams and bigrams of each of word, lemma, and part of speech, these word pairs, and the CFG production. And because those are pretty noisy, you do feature selection with a simple procedure that looks in the training data, what's the correlation between this feature value and the relations we want to look at. And if you do that, you see that always guessing restatement gives you a decent dice score. It gives you a pretty bad average F-score because it only guesses one relation. And if you do random guessing, the dice score will be lower, but the average F-score will be higher. And basically, the linguistic features work quite well. If you just have the shallow features, they're much below the linguistic features. I think they're below 50% dice score. And you see that linguistic features plus word pairs work best. And if you take all the shallow features together, you actually start to lose precision just because the features are noisy. And then the next thing would be, how can we integrate these graph features? So we extract frequent subgraphs, which means that there's a minimum frequency. If it occurs less than so and so many times, it will not be used at all. And then we also use this chi-square based feature selection, which means that any subgraph that we extract will kind of just be ignored if it doesn't correlate well with the labels we want. And then the other approach is a convolution kernel, where we use one particular kernel function, this partial tree kernel, which looks at kind of subsequences of the children, and that works because the current graphs are tree-shaped. So we had these grand plans about actually marking like things across sentences that could be informative, and then the graphs would not have been tree-shaped. And so basically here we have the linguistic features, and what I didn't tell you is that here this feature combination where you take two of these features together to have one feature for the linear classifier. If you just put the features individually into a linear classifier, then that will give you a lower score. And if you add the graph features, that gives you a nice boost, even beyond what you have with these shallow features. And if you add all the graphs, then you see that it's so noisy that it will get worse again, and much worse. And then this SVM with tree kernels, if you just use it as a linear classifier for the linguistic features, it actually works slightly better for only the linguistic features. And if you add the graphs, then you see that this kernel-based approach suffers from the same noise that the substructure extraction approach suffers from, and you get, in terms of dice score, similarly bad, but in terms of average F-score, it gets even worse. Then the question was, given that we put all these things in the graph, and that they're very nice, do we need all of them? And then there's one variant that has no information status and no semantic classes for named entities and for adverbials. And then C also skips the lemmas. And what we see is that the full graph by itself works kind of okay, and if you remove information, it gets better. If you have the linguistic features in there, then the full graph will not be that bad. If you remove the information structure and semantic classes, that's going to be slightly worse, but if you remove the lemmas as well, then it will get much better. And all means all the features, and all minus PR means that you're using the linguistic features, the graph features, and the shallow features, but not the productions. And you see that with the graph features, it actually works best, even though it's kind of not a very large difference. Then, because there's this subgraph extraction approach, there are several kind of parameters built in there. Subgraphs must occur at least 5 times. There is a size limit of 7 nodes. Why is that size limit there? Because if you extract larger substructures, you get a combinatorial problem. If you allow arbitrary large substructures, there are many, many of them, because you've got one big thing, and then you've got like 20 optional parts, and if you allow each of these optional parts in or out, you get 1 million alternatives. So you still limit the size, and then you say there must be not more than 3 feature nodes. So feature nodes are the ones that are not backbone nodes. And then another question, is this encoding of in the left graph, in the right graph, in both graphs, is this actually a good idea, or is it better if we just say it's in both graphs, or it's in none of the graphs, or if we just say well, it's in one, or well, it's in the other. So then you can kind of do some tuning to ask, like, does it work better if I choose other parameters? And you see that the minimum support setting was actually a good guess. This maximum feature edges was also a good guess. And actually it works better if you require more of these backbone nodes. So that means like you actually want 2 of these backbone nodes in there. And you see if you force larger structures, then basically it doesn't extract some things that are important, and then it gets worse again. And this way of extracting things, actually this kind of one or the other or both works best. And if you just look at kind of features about single substructures, then that doesn't work as well. And if you just look whether the substructure occurs in both graphs, then that also doesn't work as well. And where it does help is these temporal relations. So, taking a step back, what is easy for that approach? If there is parallel structure and you've got something like animate subjects, then there's a subgraph for it, and it can learn that these things tend to be good indicators. So if you have something like Oktroglu war ein wohlerzogener Bauernsohn, he was a middle class farmer son and became a lawyer, and Öcalan was the child of one of 7 children in a poor family, then you see there's an animate subject and it's past tense, so that's a good indicator that there could be a comparison relation. If you have these alt-lex indicators, in this case, well, if you have things that are not discourse connectives, but that get picked up by these word pairs or bigrams, then of course that's going to be indicative, but also the embedding type, how it's connected syntactically, is a good indicator. So here you have an als, and als can either be purely temporal or temporal and causal. And then you have als wegen neuer Haftstrafen, and then you've got something that could be a causal modifier or a temporal modifier, which again has a modifier that is causal. He tried to work as a publisher, and then basically that could give you an indication that in this particular example it's unlikely to be a causal relation. Reporting verbs and embedding type help for reporting relations. That's kind of not surprising. And where it gets hard is if you have parallel semantics, but it's not reflected on the syntactic structure, where you have eine interne Kostenrechnung, an internal estimate assumes 1.4 billion of mark, but, well, the but is implicit. Staff of the local administration thinks that it will be about the double. There you have like the internal estimate, which is actually people doing that internal estimate. And then you have ausgehen, which is kind of one verb for assuming, and rechnen mit, which is kind of another verb for kind of assuming or relating to. And like that's part of where you would probably benefit if you had some kind of frame style semantics that can kind of give you a unified representation for these kind of clauses. And of course, from internal cost estimate to kind of the people who are actually internal to this organization, that's something that's pretty complicated. Other things that are difficult are longer spans. If you have like 2 of these spans with the approach that we used, we just kind of took the content of those spans without having the internal structure, and then basically for these 2 sentences you get 2 graphs without any indication of which one is the main one. And some people who do discourse parsing kind of factor in the kind of relations that were found in the embedded arguments, and that can help. But of course, if you do that, then your evaluation becomes more complicated, because you're not just evaluating the task of kind of labeling this relation, but if you kind of assume perfect information on how it looks below that, that's an unrealistic assumption, kind of. And you can also look at kind of precision recall curves for single relations. And for comparison relations, you see that contrary to what you would assume, detecting similar things isn't particularly helpful. But for temporal relations, kind of this both thing actually helps. So that's a way of kind of comparing single features in a relation-specific way that's kind of going back away from these kind of measures that aggregate over all relations and at one particularly working point to like which one actually works better at the high precision and or at the high recall end. And that's all. So I was talking about a data set of unmarked discourse relations for German, which are available in the release 8 of the Tübingen tree bank, which has these 5 coarse and 21 fine relation types. I have to say that it's not the biggest data set there is for German. There is a bigger data set, the Potsdam Commentary Corpus 2, which has RST relations. And I presented this machine learning framework where I said, okay, given these linguistic structures, let's build something that can profit from them. And what would be nice to have would be a division of labor between kind of these feature-based and structured representation, and also to see if it works for other languages. So this was, not all of it was 2 years ago, but the main research. And for example, some people have found that for English, using these word clusters helps you quite a bit. And then you don't have word pairs, but pairs of clusters. And like the linguistic features that are presented here are quite language specific, and I would expect that whether they work or not depend both on how much work you put into the implementation, what each language does, and how you treat each language. But it might be that there are more general shallow features that work well across languages, or on the other hand, that you can construct such a graph-based representation for multiple languages which does something interesting in each language. And that's all I have. Thank you for being there and listening.
Thank you very much for the presentation of a very interesting work. So I would like to open the discussion from the floor.
Well, I would have plenty of questions for you for afterwards, but there are two which I assume are more burning for me. The first one is at the beginning when you categorized your relations. How would you describe, or if you had some thought about the coordinating and subordinating discourse relations, how this categorization relates to the syntactic dependency? Because it was quite hard for me in your article if you would say that actually some more important pieces of discourse or some topics are also syntactically expressed by coordination, whereas some subtopics are, if this somehow matches or not, or you have no idea where it's going.
So, one part of the answer is that we try to use this intuition about is it answering a common question, or is it kind of making a sub-question and then subordinating thing? That was one criterion. Then we looked if we could just kind of stick these things together with and. And with respect to the syntax, we followed some work for English, also by Escher, where they actually made a distinction, for example, for subclause adjuncts. They said if they're topicalized, then there's a good evidence that they could be as coordinating relations, such as result. When Peter had his ski holiday, he broke his leg. That would be a result in their scheme and in ours. Whereas if it's kind of normal, kind of non-topicalized, just at the end of the sentence, it would be a background information or an explanation. So basically they assume that you need both syntax and something like presentation order if you want to find this kind of coordinating or subordinating. And there is an article by Manfred Stede where he says, I don't believe in nuclearity, where he actually criticizes this idea very harshly, because he says then you need to duplicate every relation. Yeah. And honestly, we were quite optimistic that this patterns very nicely at the start, and then kind of in the process we discovered things like this concession C, where it's kind of like a concession from the semantic contribution, but suddenly it's coordinating. Or we have a parallel relation where the second conjunct is kind of even more like Peter drank 2 beer and John even drank 10 beer, where it's kind of suddenly it's not symmetrical anymore, because even though they both drank beer, the other guy like really was over the top with his 10 beer. And meaning that I think for what we did it worked, but it doesn't work as nicely as kind of we believed at the beginning.
Thank you. And my second question, I was wondering with the 3 or 4 experiments, have you actually tried to look how the structure or even lexically how the discourse arguments look like with the explicit relations, and maybe then to somehow use this as a feature, like that you train the machine to look at the explicit relations. I am not expressing myself clearly, but look at the structure of a certain category of explicits, maybe contingency, and then try to learn from it how it looks like
Okay,
when the
so
connective is not there?
I did something like that with shallow features for my diploma thesis back in 2004, and there I got the impression that it's really the explicit relations are explicit because you need to make them explicit, and the implicit relations are implicit because you can make them implicit. And that would mean that no, it's actually not that useful. And in the last 1 or 2 years, there have been Chloé Broad and Pascal Denis. So Chloé Broad is a PhD student in Paris, and they have done some experiments on that they published at this year's Coding that look quite promising.
Okay, thank you.
I have only a minor question. On one of your first slides, you have a confusion matrix between connectives in German and English. This one. On which data did you measure this?
That is. So I didn't provide any context to this because it's actually from a different talk, but I thought that it looks nice. So basically it's Europol, it's aligned with postcut, and then on the English side I tag the connectives, and on the German side I have a dictionary of what can be a connective, and I look for things that align well to things that are tagged as connectives in English. And basically postcut works better than GSOR++ for aligning connectives, because GSOR++ works kind of okay for content words, and then, or at least in what in the things that I did, it tended to not align those function words very well, just because they're kind of not. They tend to disappear if you do the intersection of the source to target and target to source alignment. And basically then I had this co-occurrence matrix, and I extracted the G-square statistic, and this is a G-square value of 5, and this means that they're pretty much uncorrelated.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have 1 or 2 questions, also minor ones. One concerns you speak about implicit and explicit relations, and one of the issues we discuss in our team are no relations. I mean, the SPAN, Discourse, TüBa-DZ, the no-rels. So I think it is difficult to say where there is an implicit relation and when there is no relation. And the same question concerns the altlex. Once I saw it on your slides, but you haven't discussed this issue. And my feeling is that the altlex is a very, very broad class of possible means how to make a connection or relation, explicit relation between 2 segments or 2 parts. And since it is such a broad class, then I would expect that it also somehow intersects with the implicit relation, that it might be difficult to say, there is an implicit relation, or somebody may say, no, I mean, this is an altlex. I can see that. So,
and there are 2 answers to that. One is that, I mean, in the Penn tree bank, in the Penn discourse tree bank, they started from this intuition that you should be able to put a connective in there, and then these alt-lexes and no-rel are the cases where suddenly you can't. And in the case of alt-lexes, you have this feeling that it's somehow redundant, and thus you end up with this category of alt-lex rather than kind of these end-rel and no-rel. And I think that's the main reason for this alt-lex category, is that there you have this well-defined category of connectives, and then you've got the rest, which is kind of a big bag of things you don't know about. And if you come from the other end and you do this hierarchical discourse annotation, and you say there are coherence relations, and we look at the coherence relations, and then we look how they're marked, then even in our case you get things that are in this kind of handbook of connectives, where we say we know that those are discourse connectives and we're happy about them, and then we got kind of successively weaker indicators. Like if you have a then, is that kind of doing a is that forcing this discourse relation, or is it just kind of additional information? And I think that alt-lex is a category, if you look at it kind of from this perspective of starting from coherence relations, you would say that there is a continuum from things that are almost like discourse connectives to things that are very, very weak indicators, and where not everyone would agree that they contribute something to the discourse. And if you look at the actual experiments that the Penn people do, at least in one experiment, they just group the alt-lexes with the implicits, and that's also what we do in these experiments. Like if it's not in this Handbuch der Konnektoren, then we say, okay, it's not a marked relation, even though like the reporting relations have typical indicators, even though like you have say, which is a pretty clear indicator, and then you've got like a long tail of verbs that don't always or not even typically indicate a speech act. Like you can also have something like this is delicious, Fred jumped up and down, where Fred jumped up and down is supposed to introduce a speech act, even though jumping up and down doesn't involve speaking normally. So and I mean, with the question of what is a no-rel, in this thing we would assume that if you want to know kind of the meaning of this kind of larger block of discourse, you need to integrate all the information from the constituent elementary units, and because you've got such a tree, you can say, okay, we've got this elementary discourse unit that we don't know what it does, we could attach it here or there and then make an argument about that. I think that this kind of way of classifying adjacent sentences in the Penn discourse tree bank scheme is less informative if you have to attach an implicit relation to a larger segment. For example, in in this example, this one actually has to do with all of these. But if you annotated that according to the Penn scheme, you'd first get this one, and it would, of course, be an instantiation relation, which is fine. And then you'd get these two, where it's a parallel relation, which again is fine. And between those, you'd get a no-rel, because this one actually has to do with this one. And if you look at it in terms of a tree, then the no-rel are kind of those where the interesting part is not between adjacent segments. I think nowhere else would either occur where the connection is higher up in the tree, or where you have between one of these topic segments and the next one.
Just one
remark, which is not that much, doesn't that much concern what you were telling, but just it has come to my mind. Quite recently, I have read a paper on implicit relations, and the author actually proposed opposite approach, in a way that normally when you look at a text and try to see at which places there are implicit relations. But what he did, or she did, was to have a text to see where there are some markers of relations, delete the markers, and look at the text again and see whether and which are the relations, or whether you can recognize the relations without the markers, and which relations can you recognize more easily than the others. And I thought this is quite an interesting approach. So what do you think about it?
Yes, I mean, people did a study in '98 where they did exactly that. They had sentence pairs and then they removed the connectives, and they found that I think for adversative relations people took longer and guessed the wrong relations sometimes. And I think for adversative relations you really need the connectives, and for many others, like these causal relations, people actually make the connection if it's not explicit. And I mean, there are people giving writing advice like, if you need to use a connective, then it's not coherent enough. Think again about what you wrote.
So, no more questions, remarks, suggestions? Well, many thanks again. I think we have got a lot of points which might be inspiration for our approach to implicit relations. I hope you have persuaded some of my colleagues who were not that much in favor of implicit relations that they now see that they should think about them, and I'm very happy for that and thankful to you for this contribution. So as I said at the beginning, we have no regular seminar next week and no regular seminar the week after. Next week the Discourse people have their own business, so to say, and other people have some other business in this room if they wish, and we will meet on the 3rd of November with Chomsky. So, thank you.